We've talked about the new lead standards and the new monitoring requirements. Now let's turn to putting the standards into action. Joining me now is Larry Wallace, who is leading EPA's team working to implement these new, more protective lead standards. Larry, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
So now that you've issued the new lead standards, what steps have to take place to implement them?
Well, Allison, the Clean Air Act assigns important rules to EPA, states, and tribal governments in some cases for implementing the NAAQS. States have the primary responsibility for developing and implementing what are called state implementation plans.
We hear this term a lot related to air quality standards. Tell us exactly what is a state implementation plan and what is it used for?
Well, state implementation plans, or SIPs as we call them, are a compilation of regulations and control programs that a state uses to carry out its responsibilities under the Clean Air Act in order to ensure that all areas of the state meet any new or revised standard. States use the SIP development process to also identify emission sources that may be contributing to non-attainment problems in affected areas and to determine the most appropriate method to reduce emissions in order for areas to be brought back into attainment of the standard.
You mentioned non-attainment and attainment, and I know we will soon begin a process to designate attainment and non-attainment areas. What process is EPA going to use to do that?
Well, the Clean Air Act requires states to place air quality monitors in targeted locations within the state to measure air quality levels related to an affected pollutant. In cases where air quality monitors measure concentrations of the pollutant or an area violates the NAAQS, the affected area may be designated as non-attainment so that control programs can be put into place in order to bring the area back into attainment of the standard. When a new or revised NAAQS is promulgated for a pollutant, the Clean Air Act allows EPA up to 2 years to designate all areas of the country as either attainment, non-attainment, or unclassifiable. The Clean Air Act allows EPA the discretion for extending that 2-year period by up to 1 year if there is insufficient information to do the designations. This means that EPA can take up to at least 3 years to do 3 years following the promulgation of a standard to the designation for any new or revised NAAQS.
Will states and tribes have an opportunity to participate in this process? In other words, do they get to make recommendations for what areas should be designated as non-attainment?
They certainly do. No later than 1 year following the promulgation of a new or revised NAAQS, states are required to submit recommendations for what areas in the state should be designated as attainment, non-attainment, or unclassifiable for areas within the state. Prior to EPA promulgating designations, if EPA makes any changes to the state's boundary recommendations, then EPA must provide the state with at least 120 days in order to determine whether, for the state to determine whether they agree or disagree with the changes that EPA has made to their designations, recommendations.
So it's a fairly lengthy process that requires a lot of work. When is EPA going to actually make these attainment and non-attainment designations?
Well, EPA anticipates promulgating designations for the lead standard in a tiered approach. What this means is that where there is adequate air quality data to make designations using the current lead monitoring network, we will designate all these areas as violating the NAAQS within 2 years following the promulgation of the NAAQS, as provided under the Act. In this case, that would mean promulgating designations for these areas by October of 2010, with the effective date being January 1st of 2011. In the remaining areas of the country where the current lead monitoring network is not sufficient to do the designations, we anticipate taking advantage of that 3-year period provided under the Clean Air Act to designate these areas using data from the newly deployed lead monitoring network. And we anticipate that these monitors from the new monitoring network will be operational by January 1st of 2010. We will use data from the new monitoring network to make designations for the remaining areas no later than October 2011, with the effective date being January 1st of 2012.
So some designations no later than October 2010, and the remainder in areas where there's insufficient data no later than October 2011.
That's correct.
Once you've made these designations, states with non-attainment areas have to turn in a state implementation plan. When do they have to submit those?
Well, the Clean Air Act provides that for areas that are designated as non-attainment for the lead NAAQS must submit SIPs to address the non-attainment problems within 18 months of the areas being designated as non-attainment. So it's 18 months after the effective date for destinations for the non-attainment area.
Okay. And how long do these non-attainment areas have to meet these new standards?
Well, under the Clean Air Act, for lead areas, all areas must attain a standard within 5 years of the destination date for the area.
How do you actually determine how big a non-attainment area is going to be, and what the boundaries are?
Well, in the proposed rule, we propose that states should use the county boundary as the presumptive boundary for the non-attainment area. And we also proposed factors that states can use in order to determine, both states and EPA can use in order to deviate from that county boundary in order to make the areas either larger or smaller.
What would some of those factors be?
Some of the factors would be things such as geographic and topographical areas, meteorological data, emissions inventory for sources that are in the prospective non-attainment areas, and information such as that. States may also use modeling or other types of data in order to substantiate whether the boundaries should be increased or decreased from the county boundary.
With some pollutants like ozone, EPA also assigns classifications to non-attainment areas depending on the severity of an area's problem. Is the agency going to do that with regards to lead?
Allison, no. As with the previous NAAQS, there will be no classification for lead non-attainment areas. Therefore, all non-attainment areas must attain the standard within the 5-year period for attaining the standards that's prescribed under the Clean Air Act.
So states that have non-attainment areas are obviously going to have to take some steps to reduce lead pollution to meet the standards. What types of sources should states be looking at for controlling emissions?
In most cases, it appears that states may be able to attain the standard in most areas by applying controls on major stationary sources of lead. We also stated in the final rule that it may be necessary in some cases for states to control smaller sources of lead emission, area sources of lead emissions, that when combined, they may contribute a significant amount of emissions toward the non-attainment problem in the area. We recommend that states, when developing their state implementation plans, start the control analysis process by looking at sources that are emitting at least 0.5 tons per year of lead or lead compounds.
One of the questions we frequently get when we revise a national air quality standard has to do with transitioning from an old standard to a new one. Has EPA finalized a strategy from moving from the 1978 lead standard to these new, more protective standards that were issued in October?
Yes, we did, Allison. We will be retaining the old lead NAAQS until 1 year after destinations are made for the new lead NAAQS, except in the cases where we have areas that are still non-attainment for the old standard. In those cases, the old lead standard will stay in place until the states develop and submit a SIP to address the new lead standards for those areas, and EPA approves that submittal.
And I believe we have just 2 of those areas in the country at present, Jefferson County, Missouri, where Herculaneum is, and East Helena, Montana. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Larry, thank you for joining us today and giving us this overview of the implementation schedule. Larry is going to remain with us after the break and will be available if you have any questions. During the break, you can send your questions in. The email address and telephone number are on your screen. We'll see you shortly.